Hello, I'm Janice Karen, Director of Integration Technologies at the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, or MHDC. I run our Data Governance Collaborative, also known as the DGC. We start each of our weekly meetings with a series of industry quick updates to learn about new and proposed regulations, laws, standards, industry initiatives, and other activity. Join us for this week's updates. If you'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. We have some late breaking news. Notice of proposed rulemaking was announced and pre-released yesterday by CMS. This is the long-awaited prior authorization rule. Those of you who've been with us for a while may remember that a version of this rule, a draft version of this rule, was released in December 2020. And then with a 13-day window across the holidays, they put out a final rule in early January. And that rule was then frozen with the change of administration. This is, in fact, the resurrection of that rule. It will be officially published in the Federal Register a week from today, December 30th. It says it will have a 90-day comment period. We have just barely started skimming it, but it does look to be fairly similar. It may differ a lot in the details. We have not gotten down to the detail level, but at the high level, it contains at least at a glance, the same components as a frozen rule. So there are changes to the patient access APIs. There is a new provider access API, which is a payer to provider data exchange using FHIR. It requires that the payer to payer APIs use FHIR. And we believe this part is optional. It was in the previous version of the rule. Support for bulk FHIR movement of payer-to-payer and not just one person at a time. And then in addition, the prior authorization requirements, we have not looked at them in excruciating detail yet. They are aligned with and recommend the use of the DaVinci. All of them are aligned with and recommend the use of DaVinci implementation guides, but they are not requiring the use of any DaVinci implementation guides, including for the prior auth. There are also 5 RFIs in the NPRM, one of which is focused around TUFCA. And as far as we can tell, the proposed implementation date for at least the majority of these new rules and new components is January 1st, 2026. So they're giving 3 years, which is a long time for them. So you can find the draft rule, which is in theory the same as the rule that's going to be published in a week, at that link. We can try to answer any questions or that people have, or if you just want to make a comment, feel free. But again, it literally came out around 5 p.m. yesterday, like I think like 4:45 or something like that. And we are just started looking at it. Anyone want to comment or have any questions that we'll try to answer?
Well, I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but it almost seems like too long an implementation timeline.
I agree with you. Actually, I was maybe not for all of the entirety of the prior auth, but even there, I think so. And my personal opinion there, they've been pushing back a lot of stuff, and really, there's been a lot of pressure, particularly on the provider side, to delay a lot of the requirements, but also on the payer side when it comes to the payer-to-payer APIs in particular. And my personal opinion is that they prejudged and built some of that in. So hopefully that doesn't mean that they have this here and then they still do all the pushback from, because that people are gonna push back regardless of what date they pick. But I agree with you.
I was just going to say the provider access API is a good addition.
Yes,
that appears to be something that we were asking about. We wondered why it was missing in the original rule, and this reinforces bidirectional exchange of data.
That's right. And I certainly that was one of the things that we highlighted in the original version of the rule as a really good step forward.
Yeah, Janice, I'll make a couple comments. One is that even though they're not requiring the use of the Da Vinci IGs, they're strongly recommending the adoption of those. So the word on the street, and this is just sort of anecdotal at this point because we're just gathering information on this, is that there was essentially a political struggle battle around the adoption of the IGs holistically across the industry for all the programs affected here, which is primarily Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and the public programs, to the point where that not requiring them but strongly recommending them was sort of a compromise position. And I agree with the comments about the timeline. I think the timeline is too far out. People will lose focus. They're not going to be driven to this with that lengthy of a requirement. So, from at least from where our perspective and the work we're doing with NEHI and the work we've been doing on prior auth for the state of Massachusetts and Commonwealth efforts, we're initially just kind of getting this last night at 5 o'clock, leaning toward continuing to encourage and support the use of the IGs within Massachusetts exchanges, at least as a position. And then CMS and ONC and the others are really looking for additional industry examples of the use of these APIs in order to support potentially future requirements for the use and adoption of them. Now one other comment, Janice. To your notes, Janice, they fully acknowledge the shortcomings of this strategy in terms of interoperability effect, potentially rework, inefficiencies, and having to revisit the adoption of standards after the industry now has essentially 3 years to implement essentially whatever they would choose.
Yeah,
So,
that was actually the comment I was going to make was, they actually explicitly talk about that. And I would actually point out that the pushback on the original payer-to-payer exchange, which was not required to be API, was actually the pushback against the implementation. And the reason it got delayed was because there was no standard. So they're kind of being inconsistent on this. And there's it's kind of like people, I mean, again, not to say that everyone's like this, but people, I feel sometimes, and this may be unfair, but sometimes it feels like no matter what you do, people are going to pick something that they can push back against because, there's a resistance to change. And, sometimes you just have to tell people to get over it and move on. And I know that's a sort of a tough love position, but, you kind of have two choices with some of this. I mean, obviously there are legitimate comments, legitimate concerns, legitimate pieces of feedback that should be taken. And I'm not suggesting that even the resistance to change is something that should be taken seriously, but the only choices end up being either there's no change and we just get stuck in a quagmire of no one wants to change anything and therefore nothing gets accomplished and nothing gets done, and we just kind of swim along as we've been dealing with all of the problems that are currently being dealt with and not solving the ones that we may have ways to solve. Or people, are told, okay, get over it, this is what you're doing. And, there's obviously a middle lane of people who want to solve the problems and who are looking to try things out and make those solutions, and are willing to sometimes perhaps have something not go as well as they'd like or fail or have to be reworked. But for the most part, the choices really are to not move or to tell people they have to forge ahead and deal with it. And sometimes the tough love is needed. That's my take on it. I guess I'm in a tough love kind of mood today.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone else about their opinions on this position that they've taken, and then whether, our position, which is more, like my theory was, well, we could start with various components of the IGs. You don't have to implement the entire thing, but for some of these you do. But really for prior authorizations, I'm thinking about it. Coverage requirements discovery is the first step in the IG process, the workflow process. We believe that's kind of ready to go at this point. I mean, there's really not much debate left around all of that, nor is it a big lift for payers and providers to adopt coverage requirements discovery. So that's the first phase in the IGs. So why if there was pushback on certain aspects of the IGs, couldn't they have said, well, we're going to phase in over the next 3 years, the 3 phases of the IG, or something to that nature? And that's kind of the approach we've been taking here in Massachusetts, is to say, well, we recognize it's a big lift, a lot of work. We're not going to, come screaming into town saying you must do it now. But, to have a phased in approach kind of gets people's feet wet. You can get into a process, you can start to learn the technologies, develop the skill sets, begin to move organizations in that direction, versus this, which feels more like, well, we've just put a pause on the IGs for now, even though they're strongly recommending them, which tells me it was more political than it was process or concerns with the IGs.
Well, I'll one thing that I'll point out is the way that they talked about the reason why they weren't requiring it was that they're still changing. Well, every standard, there's always going to be new versions and updates and changes and new requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that I see, and I think this is true across all of the IGs and all of the issues, and part of the issue is that FHIR doesn't have a backwards compatibility requirement, and some of the and IGs in general don't either. So there's a little bit more churn here perhaps than there might be in other industries where it's just part of life. But if the idea is that we're going to wait until things are not changing anymore, well, again, then we're going to be back in the camp of we're never going to do anything.
Yeah, and that's the case right now with the X12 standards, as you know, Janice, is that, there's been a lot of industry pushback on the infrequency of those standards changing and adapting to current business needs and requirements. So it's kind of like, if you don't change the standard, then it's not adapting to what the industry needs. So you have to have, and really that whole Converge 2.0 summit meeting that took place with NCVHS was really to say to the industry, well, we recognize there needs to be a cadence to change of the standards, and this is really speaking about X12, but it's true across any standard. There needs to be a cadence to that change with a pre-planned implementation schedule. So every year, there's going to be a release schedule, and in that release schedule are going to be updates and changes to the standards. And every year, NCVHS and CMS and ONC are all going to review standards, and they're going to release a new version that keeps pace with the industry. Right now, X12 is so woefully out of date. We're still on the 50/20 version of X12. That a lot of people are just throwing up their arms going, well, it's dated, it's obsolete, it doesn't meet our needs. We use it because we're required to under HIPAA, but it's not keeping pace. So keeping pace with change is an essential part of standards. And the fact that they're not really, to your point, Janice, recognizing that in this, the way they're approaching this. I mean, granted, too much change, certainly I can understand, but there's a balance point. There's a balance
exactly
point. Yeah.
Yep. So,
Right.
all right, well, obviously we'll be digging into this, and we'll be bringing a much more detailed analysis to the future DGC meetings, and probably, obviously looking at each of the different components in detail and what they require and what they entail, and having discussions about what that means to folks in the future. But we wanted to make sure that we at least put this in front of you immediately. Again, it's not officially out yet. It's officially out next on the 13th. There should be a 90-day comment period starting on the 13th for folks who are interested in doing that. We haven't talked about it internally yet, but it's certainly possible that we will make a comment. I don't know for certain that we will, but it is something I think we would consider doing. So, one option there, as well as folks in the DGC, if is to, bring your feedback to us as well. And certainly as we discuss things in the DGC, if we do comment, we would certainly incorporate that as part of what we state. You know, the folks that we're talking to indicate X, Y, and Z as part of our comments as well. Any final thoughts or comments before we move on? This is a big one, obviously. All right, let's move on to the next big one. So HHS has released some, and the OIG actually has released some guidance on the use of tracking technologies and HIPAA. You may recall that there have been several really major problems with PHI getting tracked, and really bad cases of data both within portals and on appointment scheduling site websites and other things like that. And so they've come out with some very specific guidance on what is and is not allowed under HIPAA in terms of tracking technologies. And they were explicitly talk about this encompassing everything, whether it's a website or a device. Although, as you'll see, as we get further into the discussion, obviously, third-party apps are outside of HIPAA, so they do not have control over that, but they point out that the FTC has rules that likely will also consider any type of real tracking technology that pulls PHI as a violation. So they specifically called out cookies, metapixel, well, pixels, but metapixels is the big one that has had a lot of problems this year. Session replay scripts, fingerprinting scripts, which is actually a new one on me. Tracking codes, which are mostly used in apps, but not limited to those things. And some of the points that they made, they kind of started by talking a little bit about what actually constitutes PHI in these situations. And one of the things that they pointed out is that in this case, because you're at a site that has medical information or where you could possibly infer, or even the fact that someone was visiting a site for a particular hospital or a particular medical center, if it is likely, the information is likely PHI if it includes anything that's identifiable about the person, even if there's no direct medical information included. And so that includes the IP address, a device ID, or even location info. So they were very clear about that, which I thought was interesting. It totally makes sense to me, but the fact that they were explicit about that I thought was interesting, because I haven't necessarily seen anything where they talk about that situation explicitly before. They do make a difference between authenticated and not authenticated pages. So if you're logged in and there's any tracking tools on an authenticated page, meaning that you're logged in or otherwise identified, cannot gather any PHI of any sort unless the vendor, one, meets the definition of a business associate, all the HIPAA privacy rules are followed, and a BAA exists with the tracking vendor. On unauthenticated pages, generally those don't fall under HIPAA, they're not considered PHI, but if those pages talk about specific medical conditions, or the pages themselves have access to health information, they are, and this may be context dependent. So they talk specifically about pages that allow you to log in, but you're not logged in yet. And that page itself may not be considered carrying PHI to a tracking tool if the person's not logged in, but as soon as they log in, it is. So that the page itself actually changes its status based on the context of the session. So I thought that was interesting. And then they point out the apps. We're actually going to continue on the next slide, but any comments or thoughts so far?
Just a question, Janice. How does
Yeah.
so obviously the FTC breach rules and the apps not covered by HIPAA are governed under FTC rules. How does this relate to those? In other words, where is the line drawn, I guess, between the tracking apps and then the tracking technology, I should say, not apps, the tracking
Well,
technologies.
what they're
and the
talking about
yeah.
here is not when I say apps here, I'm not talking about the tracking app. Here, the apps are
Okay.
the apps that the patients or consumers are using.
Right, on their
So,
phones or whatever. Yeah.
right, or on their computer, whatever it is. So if you're using a third-party app on any device or any computer that is not provided or explicitly part of, that is not provided by a health system or explicitly part of their website, then that's what they're saying is outside of the purview and covered by the FTC. But so the tracking, if those apps use a tracking service, they don't fall under the guidance. But the FTC has some pretty strict rules around it. And as we saw earlier in the year, the FTC is looking pretty closely. I mean, we spent several weeks looking at their RFI, where they were very clearly taking a very dim view of this type of data surveillance. And looking, so there are current rules that protect you that are specific to health information, but just in general, the FTC clearly was looking to crack down on this type of surveillance and tracking practice, generally, even putting aside the health data implications.
Okay.
So I think that right now it's probably a little bit less clear in terms of how to handle that situation if you encounter it. But I suspect that within the next batch of time, and I don't know if I mean 6 months or a year or exactly what I mean by batch of time, but soon, I suspect based on the tone and breadth of that RFI that the FTC put out about data surveillance, that there will be a pretty serious new set of rules with some serious crackdown behind it on data surveillance in general. So,
Good.
all right,
Good.
let's go on to the next slide and look at the rest of this.
Yeah, I was just going to comment.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That this seems to somewhat broaden the definition of PHI. What is mentioned in the first bullet there, to me, is PII, but there's nothing particularly about health in it.
Well, we've had this discussion before in some context, because, for instance, if I am standing in front of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, for instance, or Joslin Diabetes Center, that even though you don't know for certain, I could be there visiting someone or taking someone else to an appointment, or I could be standing there because a restaurant I like happens to be in the lobby or something. There's still an imputation physically. But now if I'm actually going to the Dana-Farber website, you at least know that I have an interest. And if I go look at a page that's specific to like non-hairy cell leukemia or something, right? Pick some specific type of cancer at the Dana-Farber website, then, and that's being tracked, you know that I probably either have that or someone I am close to has that, and you can use that to do all kinds of things. Even if it's not me personally who has that particular health condition, you can certainly infer, and even if you're wrong, make that assumption and create data about me that says that I do or says that I likely do. And so I do think that it's a sensible thing. Whether it's explicitly been done before or not, that's a different question. But certainly I've seen discussion of the physical location of someone being present at the physical location being considered PHI. And so I see this as a logical extension.
Yeah, I can see that. I think the example in the news most recently is, what if I'm about to enter an establishment across the street from a Planned Parenthood clinic?
Yep.
What might somebody infer about that wrongly?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously there, you have to, like, where exactly that gets defined and refined as a question. But certainly, as far as the website goes, you don't have the "I'm adjacent to it" question. You're clearly at the website of, the abortion clinic or Dana-Farber or Joslin Diabetes or some other place where it's clear that if you're there, either it's very likely that either you or someone you're with or someone you're close to is getting treatment for something that particular establishment treats. You're not going to sit there and browse 10 pages on hairy cell leukemia if you don't have a keen interest in hairy cell leukemia for some personal reason or professional reason, but at least some specific reason. So I think it does make sense.
Well,
All right, let's go on.
I guess I'll have to stop doing that. Then. Cheapers. Joking.
I know your daily. Let me learn about the condition of the day, right?
Right.
So this second set of stuff, they start talking about what concepts. So for those things, if you don't, you can also do the tracking with explicit consent of the person being tracked, the same way that you can, if there's under HIPAA, basically under HIPAA, if they don't qualify as a business associate and you don't have a BAA, you can still share data, but you need explicit consent. So here they're talking about what constitutes consent in this milieu. And so what I thought was interesting is that they were very clear about what doesn't constitute consent. So telling people in your privacy policies that they might be tracked. The privacy policies notice, terms of use, data policies, whatever. That's not sufficient. That does not constitute user consent for sharing that data. Pop-ups or other browser or app notifications saying that they are enabling cookies does not constitute consent for tracking via the cookies. Also, so those two I thought were important because those are probably the two most common ways that users of any website, app, whatever, agree to things, often without realizing they're agreeing to them. So they're very clear that those aren't sufficient. But the other thing that I thought was interesting, because a lot of what the metapixel thing, a lot of what they were trying to say was, well, we don't actually store any of that data. And so what the guidance says is that it is not okay. The violation happens on data transmission. It does not happen on data storage or data usage. So the tracking, even if the tracking vendors do what they say they're going to do and remove all PHI from the data that they receive before they store it, or de-identify all the data before they do anything with it, disclosure of the information has already happened at that point. As soon as the information is sent to them via the tracking, it has been disclosed. And if there isn't a BAA and HIPAA privacy rule permission for that disclosure, then that's a violation. And they also explicitly call out that if a tracking vendor does qualify as a business associate and there is a BAA in place, those agreements, and this is pretty standard anyway, but those agreements must outline explicitly what is and is not allowed in terms of the data use, further disclosures, data safety, etc., reporting. I mean, all of the other HIPAA standards, and those must be abided by, or that's a HIPAA violation. Again, that last bullet point is kind of comes with the territory, but they still wanted to explicitly call it out, and I think it's worth thinking about. So there's a link to the guidance. Any further comments or thoughts on this side of it? All right, then let's go ahead and go on to the next one. So this is also interesting. It's HHS has put out a roadmap for behavioral health integration with primary care. And what they actually did was they put out a press release. And a lot of the press release talks about other programs or other things, but they also talks about future plans. And so we're not going to cover all of it, and this is really just some highlights. The one in blue is the one we're going to talk about in some detail. But there are some changes to, they're going to pay for behavioral health services in primary care settings. Apparently that was not happening before. There's going to be additional training programs through HHS. They're going to change the oversight rules for licensed counselors who are not medical practitioners, and require less direct oversight. They're going to try to better enforce parity requirements, enhance programs in schools. They're taking a good hard look at what they're calling electronic care platforms and the related regulations, and also the related payments, to try to encourage more use of digital behavioral health within the traditional healthcare system. So I thought that was interesting. That's an area that might impinge on a lot of the stuff that we do. And then here's the big one. ONC is going to include behavioral health and its integration with primary care in US CDI version 4. So let's step back for a second. What is US CDI's purpose? US CDI's purpose is to set the minimum data standard for interoperability. And US CDI, although all of the rules still specify version 1 explicitly, US CDI is meant to be the thing that gets referenced in various regulations requiring data exchange, data use, data capabilities. So to this point, behavioral health data has, and all Part 2 data has explicitly been excluded from the US CDI requirements and from those mandated exchanges. Now, you may remember, for those of you who I'm not sure if all of you were here last week, we looked at an NPRM, which was looking to possibly get rid of some of the restrictions on Part 2 data use. And this clearly goes hand in hand. And there is clearly a push to loosen the restrictions on Part 2 data segregation and exchange, and the amount of consent that's required to do anything with that data. So I don't know exactly what's going to come of that. The draft version of US CDI version 4 should be coming in January. That's the annual schedule. We'll certainly know a lot more when that drops. But there is a clear, not just one thing, but there's a clear set of actions that are happening within HHS, which are clearly moving in the direction of taking the behavioral health and substance abuse and the other components of Part 2 data and looking to treat it more like every other bit of health data. Don't know what's going to come of that. Nothing, at best, we're at the, proposed rule stage with all of it, but there have been multiple movements in the last couple of weeks in that direction, and we'll have to see what comes of it. And then the last point that I want to highlight really quickly is that they also, without any details in what I looked at, talked about some new quality measures around behavioral health and behavioral health integration with primary care. So there's the press release I mentioned is there. There are some additional links to specific programs that are called out. There is not additional data on the ONC role or the US CDI version 4. That will presumably be coming when the draft drops in January. Any comments, thoughts here? If not, then all right, let's go on to the next slide. And oh, that's right, there's one. So one other thing that happened this week is that CMS they did this via a FAQ entry, which is kind of a strange way to do it. But they have extended the enforcement discretion around including data from multiple providers in the good faith estimates for uninsured and self-pay patients. So you may remember that they put a 1-year enforcement discretion on that. It was set to expire in January. And so the new extension is pending further regulation. And they specifically talk about that pending further regulation, that further regulation being around the development of APIs for this process. So, which is interesting because while I've heard a bunch of discussion around doing that and different people wanting to set up more standardized ways to do that, to the best of my knowledge, no one is actually actively working on a standardized API for this portion of the process. There are standardized APIs for other portions of the process. For instance, there are people, DaVinci has a group that has worked on APIs for the good faith estimate to the provider to payer exchange for sending a good faith estimate to become an advanced explanation of benefits for insured patients. But to the best of my knowledge, and there are people who've been working on how to classify these services together so that there's consistent standardized ways to define this is what a knee surgery is. But as far as having you know, a standardized API for exchanging the co-provider data and getting that to the convening provider, that's something that I've not seen actively worked on yet. So any comments, thoughts, questions there? All right, let's go on to the next slide. And if you'll pause there. So I hope you learned a lot from our quick updates. If you have any questions and you're interested in learning more about the DGC and our other activities, please email me at the email address you see on the screen, dgc@myhealthdata.org. Thank you very much. That ends this week's quick updates.